The So Called Coase Theorem by Deirdre McCloskey out of the University of Iowa and Erasmus University Rotterdam. When George Stigler started around 1960 touting an idea he thought he had gotten from his colleague at the law school at Chicago, Ronald Coase, as a theorem, Paul Samuelson was not amused. George told the story that he and Coase and Aaron Director and others shuffled chairs around to represent property rights at a dinner party one evening. Chicago in those days was like that. I attended many such parties that evolved into seminars no longer. At the end of which George went home with what he thought was a new theorem. Where's the theorem? Snorted Paul Anthony Samuelson of Gary, Indiana. Where's the set of assumptions, A, applying a set of conclusions, C? Or more exactly, where's the interesting piece of valid reasoning? As so often, Paul was right and George was wrong. George Stigler was among the worst historians of economic thought in the history of the discipline, mainly because he used the history as an ideological tool and was ruthless in doing so. He read a lot, but was defective in paying attention. Thus, the Coase Theorem. The bizarre doctrinal history of the so-called Coase Theorem is given its most thorough airing in a paper by Steve Medema and Warren Samuels from 1994. I have been worrying about the point ever since first teaching Coase's famous paper on the problem of social cost to graduate students at Chicago in 1968. I was made uncomfortable with George's strange tale, and gradually I figured out why. Economists have gotten the theorem wrong. In fact, they've gotten it backwards. The reason they have is that they practice blackboard economics and cannot grasp the anti-blackboard economics of the Marshallian sort that Coase and, on a rather lower level, by practice. The theorem is supposed to be that it doesn't matter where you place the liability for, say, smoke pollution, because in a world of zero transactions costs, the right to pollute will end up in the hands that value it most. If breathers value it most, they will buy it. If steelmakers value it most, they'll keep it. Literally hundreds of articles and expositions and textbooks, beginning with the late George Stigler, have put forward this interpretation of the theorem. For instance, in Stigler's 1966 textbook, where he calls it a remarkable proposition to us older economists who have believed the opposite for a generation. Thus, a fine book by Shugart, Chappell, and Cottle on marginal economics says thus, quote, in the absence of transactions costs, the allocation of resources is independent of the initial assignment of property rights, end of quote. Something like a dozen people in the world understand that the Coase theorem is not the Coase theorem. I'll adopt the convention of putting quotation marks around the non-Coasean Coase theorem. One of this select group is Ronald Coase himself, so I suspect we blessed few are right. The Coase theorem, as advertised by George Stigler or sneered at by Paul Samuelson, is actually Adam Smith's theorem, 1776. It is wholly explicit in F.Y. Edgeworth in 1881, and with all the bells and whistles in Arrow and De Brew in 1954. Smith, Edgeworth, Arrow, De Brew, and many others noted that an item gravitates by exchange into the hands of the person who values it the most if transactions costs, such as the cost of transportation, are not too high. Why a student of economic thought like Stigler would call this oldest idea in economics remarkable, I do not know, though I say it is not the only strange reading that Stigler gave. Applying it to pollution rights is unremarkable. What's the theorem? Where's the theorem, rather? Coase's actual point, the core of a Coasean economics, was to note what happens in the many important cases in which transactions costs cannot be neglected. If the situation does have high transactions costs, then it does matter where the liability for pollution is placed. In consequence, as Coase has stressed throughout his career, the economist's preference for a simple, blackboard solution taxing the party that causes the pollution, as Pigou and Samuelson suggest, is no longer defensible. One could look on Coasean economics as a program for taking seriously Lancaster and Lipsey's general theory of second best from 1956. If Coase, also at the London School of Economics, had not started the program 20 years before Lancaster and Lipsey, Coase's work from the 1930s to his Nobel lecture is one long demurral from the Pigouvian and Samuelsonian tradition that dominates modern economics. As I put it once, I should report my long-standing conviction that Coase's theorem is not the point of Coase's article in 1960. Coase's article was not meant to show that we live already in the best of all possible worlds, as Stigler was inclined to assume in this and other cases, but on the contrary, that if we did, there would of course be no need for policy, and that, in fact, as Coase argued, also in the 1937 article, transaction costs push our world unpredictably far from the blackboard optimum, thus the second best. But I have given up hope of persuading any other economist of this interpretation, since the only economist who shares it is Ronald Coase, and we know how unpersuasive he has been. I would add now, and a dozen other economists equally unpersuasive. Coase's actual contribution to economics has been to make a point he made in 1937 about some of Caldor's early writing. Coase says that Caldor assumes all relevant prices are known, but this is clearly not true of the real world. End of quote. The misunderstanding of the Coase theorem arises from economists thinking that Coase is trying, like them, to flee this world. End of quote. Some years ago, I had an email conversation about the actual and ersatz Coase theorems with Tom Weisskopf at the University of Michigan. Tom, you know, is a well-known Marxist economist. Unlike most economists, Marxist or otherwise, he's willing to listen, and not just to me. Weisskopf, quote, I've been reading Bob Kuster's piece on the Coase theorem in the New Palgrave. It strikes me as quite consistent with the view that whether externalities can be best addressed by state action or provide market transactions is always an empirical issue. I take it we agree on this. I, McCloskey, say, yes we do, and with Ronald Coase. Back to him. I was just wondering whether you would include Kuda among the dozen or so in your corner. I replied, no, Bob gets it wrong. With the other N to 12 folks, he also gets it wrong in his book with Tom Uhlin, Law and Economics. On page 5, in a Stiglerian vein, they call the Coase theorem, which is equivalent to Adam Smith's theorem, a remarkable conclusion, echoing Stigler. Dick Posner gets it wrong in his book, Economic Approach to Law, most egregiously on page 636. And then throughout it, he gets it right once. These excellent scholars get it wrong for the same reason. They do not appreciate the doctrinal history from which Coase was writing, and which Medema and Richard Zerbe illuminate in a recent article about Coasean economics from 1997. And in particular, they do not appreciate Coase's distaste for blackboard economics. Pigou and Samuelson into easy solutions to difficult problems. The so-called Coase theorem is framed in a Benthamite spirit wholly obnoxious to Coase. Weisskopf, I here put words in his mouth. Can that be right? They all got it wrong? Back to me, that is, McCloskey. I don't expect you to believe it, since no one does except the blessed dozen and Ronald Coase himself. In Coase's introduction to his little collection of substantive articles, The Firm, the Market, and the Law, 1988, you can find statements that sound like the Coase theorem, but more than That sounded like the Coase theorem, no scare quotes, the actual theorem. If you read all of Coase's works, you will see that the actual theorem, besides being the prose meaning of the last few pages of the problem of social cost, which most economists appear not to have read, is consistent with the rest of Coase's views. Coase's second published paper, the famous one in 1937 on the firm, says that transaction costs matter. So have all his papers over and over again. The version of the Coase theorem that Stigler popularized says the opposite. Weisskopf. If I understand your point, the true Coase theorem implies that one cannot, in general, efficiently internalize an externality by taxing or subsidizing whoever is generating the negative or positive externalities, because, in light of transactions costs, this would generally not result in the right to the resource affected going to the person who values it the most. Back to me. Yes, that's right. Another way of putting it, as Coase does, is to point out that, quote, whoever is generating the externality, end quote, is not a meaningful notion. Coase has the famous and confusing railway and farmer example who causes the burnt fields of corn, the railway which makes the sparks, or the farmers which plant the imprudently close to the line crops. The question naturally arises in the common law. On a blackboard, by contrast, you can't see it. Equalize marginal private and social cost. That's all. A better example is noise pollution around airports. We usually think of the airports and the airplanes as the cause. But wait, suppose that there were no ears close to the airport, or that the ears were easily protected from the noise. In that case, the noise would be harmless, and it would be silly to curb it. So the presence of ears is just as much a cause of the vibrations in the plane's motors. Where then should the Pigou in Samuelson tax be placed? Weisskopf. Rather than implying that the state ought to get out of the business of dealing with externalities, doesn't this imply that the state ought to concentrate on defining and transferring property rights instead of taxing and subsidizing in the Pigou and Samuelson way, getting the entitlements right rather than the prices right? Me. Yes, it certainly does, which is why the notion that Coase justifies doing nothing is wrong. Coase, who emphasizes transaction costs, says in effect, because the transaction costs are high, it matters where the resources start out. Pigouvian taxes are not going to get the right solution, except by happy accident. Face up to the hard facts of life. Transaction costs are high, which is another way of saying that second best sometimes applies. Amazingly, economists have understood him to be saying transaction costs are low, relax, which is another way of saying that first best always applies. But there's a further point that Coase makes in every paper he's written, which may explain why people such as George Stigler think he is saying that we do already live in the best of all possible worlds. The point is that getting the entitlements right is devilishly difficult with the governments we actually have. Coase is forever saying that this or that proposal for a public policy entails knowing things that no economist can in fact know. He claims, with considerable empirical evidence, that in many cases, laissez-faire will be, in practice, better than what we will get from actual governments, though neither is perfect. We live in a second best world, that is, a world of transaction costs. The methodological point is that Coase does not claim to have proven laissez-faire on the blackboard. He is in effect saying, if you look at the FCC or the Lighthouse or the law of liability, you see that the governmental attempts to guide things minute by minute, as you say, Tom, getting the prices right, don't work very well. Maybe it's better to just deal the cards and play. But in this vale of tears, there are no guarantees. It may not work like some curves you have drawn. Life is hard. Knowledge is scarce. Grow up and admit that you can't extract policy from a couple of lines on a blackboard. End of exchange. To put it in a wider context, the Yu and Samuelson and Stigler were modernists. On or about December 1910, wrote Virginia Woolf, Human Nature Changed. The modernism of Woolf and Picasso, Russell, and Le Corbusier has ruled intellectuals since then. The anti-modernist English poet Philip Larkin complained in the 1960s about irresponsible exploitations of technique in contradiction to human life as we know it. This is my essential criticism of modernism, whether perpetrated by Charlie Bird Parker, Pound, or Picasso, or a Coasean economist would add, perpetrated by 4th P. Paul, Samuelson that is. Larkin explained the reference to Parker, 1920 to 1955, an innovative saxophonist, in one of his columns on jazz. Quote, said by another jazz critic, after Parker, you had to be something of a musician to follow the best jazz of the day. Of course, after Picasso, after Pound, there could hardly have been a concise summary of what I don't believe in art. The artist has become over-concerned with his material, hence an age of technical experiment, and, in isolation, has busied himself with the two principal themes of modernism, mystification and outrage. End of quote. Modernism has had some good moments, such as the Ronchamp Chapel by Le Corbusier or the Foundations of Economic Analysis by Paul Samuelson. It was worth a try, though on the whole it did not work very well. Have a look at economic policy, or if that doesn't appall you, then look at the average academic article in economics, pure theoretical modernism. Blackboard economics gone loco. I commend Coase for his old-fashioned ways. The old-fashioned ways have become the latest fashion, actually. You read it here. Ronald Coase is a postmodern economist, and his theorem, a postmodern one, is about the difficulty of knowing what is to be done. The end.